Today, we configure a Duet Wi-Fi 2 3D printer mainboard. Let's do it. Get it? Duet? Okay, that's not that funny. So I recently acquired this Duet Wi-Fi board to use on some of my future projects and to check out some of the features that it offers, mainly 32-bit processing. Now my buddy Walter over at Country 3D did his best to help me get this thing set up via a live stream, but I actually had to go back and sit down and learn quite a bit to get it working well with my printer. Now Duet recommends that you use the Reprap configuration tool to get this configured, which is the easiest way to get it done, and that's how I'm going to show you how to do it today. But you can just cable straight up to the board and get your networking set up and then configure it by hand if you wish. Now before we get into the configuration tool, let's take a close-up look at the board and get the lay of the land. So we've got our Wi-Fi module and our SD card, we've got all the motor connections down here, and we've got our terminals for our heater cartridges for the Hotends. The Duet Wi-Fi comes with TMC 2660 stepper drivers, and they are super quiet. We have two pretty substantial terminals, one for the heated bed and one for the DC power in, and it's supported by a blade fuse, which is always good to see. We have reset and erase buttons, micro USB in, Hotend thermistors go right here, bed thermistor goes over here, your end stops go right here in the middle, and your fans go in this section. On this side are the fans that can be controlled, this side are the fans that are always on, and this is fan 0 right here in the middle. You do have the usual LCD connectors available on this board, but unfortunately there's almost no LCD screens that are compatible with the Duet Wi-Fi yet. Duet does offer a touchscreen that works with this board. So this video is going to be kind of long, but it should be a fairly complete guide on how to get up and running on your Duet. So let's not waste any more time, let's head in and get this thing configured. So here's the Reprap firmware configuration tool. On the first page, we're going to go with custom configuration. Click next. We'll make sure we're on Duet 2 Wi-Fi. We're running 1.2 or newer firmware. We want it to be compatible with Marlin. We want to check this box to enable power panic. You can resume prints if there's a power failure. And I found that you can just leave this as default. At least on my printer it seems to work. But we'll circle back on that in a minute. There are a few more things we have to change. So the printer we're working with is a Core XY, so we'll click the Core XY tab. We'll set the dimensions of the printer, 330, 330, 400, and let's click Next. Now we'll set the motor specific options. Again, these are going to be different for every printer, but this is what I did to make mine work. So for X and Y, 80 steps per millimeter should be just fine. Both my X and Y are running forwards. Max instant speed change, this is your jerk value. I'm going to set these to 10. Max speed, I'm going to set to 300. Acceleration, I'm going to set to 3000. And motor current for this printer, I'm going to set to 950. Now in my Z motor, since this is a Core XY and the bed goes down as it prints, the Z motors get flipped to backwards. These are 4-start lead screws, 8mm, so it's going to be 400 for steps per millimeter. Jerk value can be left default, 0.2. Max speed, 3 is fine. Acceleration, I'm going to lower to 100. Again, 950 milliamp for the motor current. I only have one extruder, and then we have the settings for the motor. On my printer, the orientation of the motor is set so that it'll have to be running backwards. I'm going to start at 98 steps per millimeter. This is a direct drive MK8 extruder. You will need to calibrate your extruder for whichever one you use. Jerk value of 2 is fine. Maximum speed, I'm going to set to 25. Acceleration, I'm going to set to 10,000. Again, motor current, 950 milliamp. Down here at the bottom is where you can set when the motors go idle and what percentage of current they're getting when they go idle. Default is 30 and 30%. I'm going to leave mine default, but say if your Z-axis was falling when it goes idle, you might want to increase this. So let's click Next. Now the Z-probe and the end stops were somewhat tricky for me. I don't use a Z-probe, so I thought, well, I'll just set it to no Z-probe. But if you do that, it doesn't put entries in the config file for the Z end stop. So to get around this, I selected Switch. This is trying to tell you that it's using a micro switch to probe the bed, but I'm just using it as an intended end stop. So I set it to Switch, probing speed, I put it to 0, trigger height, 0, trigger height on bed, 0, and trigger value that can stay 600. But if you set the parameters this way, it will put the correct configuration item in the file for a manual Z in-stop. On my printer, I set X, Y, and Z to active low, normally open switches, and all in-stop locations were at the low end, meaning that the in-stop is triggered when the printer is at the 000 position. I left all the homing speed, travel speed, and Z dive height to default. So we can click Next. For the heaters, for the extruder, and the bed, I just left everything default, and my thermistors seem to work just fine. You might have to adjust these depending on which bed, hot end, and thermistor you're using, and you might also want to go with a PID control instead of bang bang for your bed. Again, I just left these default, so click Next. Number of tools, I only have one hot end, so I left this default. Click Next. Bed compensation, I don't use this feature, and I don't think it would really work that well without a probe, even if you wanted to run around and do it manually. So I just left everything default because I don't really find a lot of value in this. So click Next. And here's where you're going to set it up so you can connect to your wireless network. So call your printer something. This is a Tronxy. Enter the name of your wireless network, and it is case sensitive. You can set a password for your Duet board, so every time you try to log into the web GUI, it's going to ask you for a password. I'm going to leave mine blank, and then set your Wi-Fi password. By default, the Duet board is going to grab its IP address from your wireless network via DHCP. That means it's just going to grab a random IP out of the pool. Now you can uncheck this box and assign it a static address. It's important that that IP address not be used by any other device because that can really confuse your network. But if you don't assign a static IP address, that IP could change at any time as you lose your DHCP lease. For now, we're going to stick with default and use DHCP. We'll take another look at this in a second. Make sure enabled HTTP is checked. That's what enables the web GUI. And click Next. And then on the last page, this is where you can set up your fans. And this is another trick that I found really useful. So on fan 0, I plugged in my part cooling fan to the fan 0 port. So I'm going to set the default value to 0. That means that the initial value of the fan will be 0, so the fan won't be spinning when the fan turns on. I left all the invert output to no. Frequency of 500 seems to be fine. Thermostatic control, this is so you can set a certain temperature for the fan to come on at, but since this is part cooling, we don't want it to come on at a certain temperature, we want it to come on with G-codes. So we'll leave that for no. And then for fan 1, this is where I plugged in my hot end cooling fan. I left it at 100%, so when it comes on, it's full blast. I did enable thermostatic control for this fan. It's based on the hot end's temperature, and I left it at the default 45 degrees centigrade. That means that the fan will stay off until the hot end reaches 45 degrees, then it'll be full blast. Fan 2, I just left default because I don't have 3 fans on this printer. The Duet uses the M106 command to set the fan to either 0 or off, or 255 to full blast. Some of the slicers are going to use the M106 command to turn the fan on, and the M107 command to turn the fan off, like in Marlin. So if you set it up this way, you'll have to make a lot fewer slicer changes. And then click Finish. It'll create a zip file for you. You can download it. Since this is the first time we're going to make config changes, open up the zip file. Remove your SD card from your Duet board and plug it into your computer. Go into the sys directory on the SD card, copy everything from that config file that we downloaded, and paste it into that sys folder. And select Replace the files in this destination. That just successfully wrote your whole config to your SD card. Now you can remove your SD card and plug it back into your Duet board. Now boot up your Duet board. You can either use USB, or if you already have it hooked up to your power on your printer. Once you've reset your Duet board after you put your SD card back in, you're not going to know what IP DHCP has set for that board. So you're going to have to go into your router to figure that out. In my router, we'll view the list. Express IF Inc. is what you're looking for, and mine is at 1.187. Now I have set that to manual in my router so that 187 gets selected for my Duet every time, but you can also set it static on the Duet. For now, we're going to go to 1.187. And if everything went right, here's your web interface for the Duet Wi-Fi. So we've got the Duet board configured, it's hooked up to the Wi-Fi, and we can get to the web GUI. And I do know that this configuration works for this machine, but I want to run through a few things to troubleshoot / test your printer before you get started printing, just in case some of those settings don't work for you. First thing I want to look at is the motors page. Now note, when I hooked up my stepper motors to my main board, all of the motor cables All 5 of them are the same direction. I mention this because if you flip your motor cable over, it's going to have the same effect as these buttons. It will either run it forwards or backwards. Now in this configuration on a Core XY, I've got the X and Y motors both set to forward. That means that the firmware will take care of the rest, since we have it set up as a Core XY machine. So you don't have to worry about that. Both of them will be set to forward on this page. Now I have both of the Z motors, they're set to backwards. That's because the bed's moving down. So as it moves down, it goes into the positive. That's why I put those motors as backward. Again, a cable change could change all of this configuration. And then the extruder motor I set to backwards because it depends on which side of the extruder the motor is on. It would just as easily, the motor could be on the other side of the extruder and you would have to flip it to forwards. Now let's look at the in-stop page. On this printer, they're just regular micro switches. And they're normally low. That means the switch is open. The in-stop input pins on a Duet Wi-Fi are 3 pins. Positive, negative in the center, and then signal. I have my in-stop switches connected to the positive pin and the signal pin. And then in-stop location, I have all of them set to the low end because the low end is where 0 would be. So I've got an in-stop on this side of the X carriage. That's 0 for X. I've got an in-stop on the front side of the Y. When it hits that, that's 0 for Y. And then I've got an in-stop right here on the top of Z. So when you're all the way up, that's 0 for Z. So while you're getting everything set up and axes are moving around, if something collides or is moving in the wrong direction, this emergency stop button is really handy to have. It will stop the board really quickly and reboot. Just know it's there if you need it. So when you head into the GUI and your configuration is complete, the easiest way to test this stuff is just to home things manually to make sure you got your configuration correct. So we'll home X. It should lower the build platform 5 millimeters, touch the in-stop twice, and then bring the platform back up. Home Y, same process, and then home Z. So all that's working correctly. You can click the heaters to activate them. This one's for the hot end, this one's for the bed. We'll set the hot end to 100 and the bed to 30. We just want to make sure they're both heating up. And it looks like they are, so we can just click on those again to deactivate them. It's also a good idea to make sure that your extruder is turning in the correct direction. You can do that down here. We'll take a look at config.g. So that configuration tool we used, that just generated these configuration files. So you can edit these on the fly. So say your X motor was moving in the wrong direction. You just come down here to drives, P0 is the X motor, you change that S1 to an S0. Now your motor is going to move in the opposite direction. Same way with these others. P0 is X, P1's Y, P2 Z, P3 is extruder. Same thing with your in-stops. Right now we have a Z minimum in-stop and you need a Z maximum. You just change that Z1 to Z2. And if you click Save Changes, that'll load these changes and reboot the board and everything will be updated. Now because of the way the board is used with the firmware, you're actually with these config files just sending it G-code commands. One thing that was kind of tricky when I was setting this up is that when I would home, let's say X, the motor would turn the carriage in the wrong direction, so it would head away from the in-stop. So each time you hit one of those home buttons, there's a script for that. So let's take home X. When you hit that button, it's just sending G-code commands to get it to move all the way in one direction. Now, if it was moving the opposite direction, you could just take that negative off that 335, and that would send it in the opposite direction. You would have to do that in all the locations. So the first one is for the initial move, and the second one is for the slow move. Having the home all file and all these other home files, that gets really confusing about what you've changed and what you haven't. So I highly recommend, if you can't correct the issue in config G, maybe by making the motor turn one direction or the other, go back through the configuration tool and make a whole new config and upload it again. That way you don't have any question about what changed. This will be a solid config and you'll have it all in one file. If you do need to re-upload one of those configurations, just go to the General tab and you can upload the whole zip file right here and it will load that configuration automatically. After you get everything set like you want, I highly recommend that you take a backup of this config. All you have to do is remove the SD card from the Duet, put it in the computer, and copy the sys directory over to your desktop. You can compress it from there if you want to, but this way you have a config that you know it works, and if you do make a change on the fly, you can go back to the default that did work easy enough. Now that we're in here changing things, let's go ahead and finish up our network config. So we'll go back into config.g. Now when we did the configuration tool, we just left it at the default DHCP. Now every time the Duet board boots up, it might have a chance of grabbing a different IP address than what you're used to. So to keep it from changing, we can set it to a static IP. Again, be very careful when doing this because you don't want to use an IP that's already being used on your network. That can cause some serious issues having a duplicate IP on the network. So pick an IP that you know isn't in use and preferably not in your DHCP pool. The easiest way to get this done is to cable back up USB and set it from command line. Now since we've already logged onto the wireless, this command is going to be saved on the board and we don't really need to run it again. So we can just go ahead and delete this whole line. Let's go ahead and save changes. And we won't reboot now, but we will here in a little bit. So we'll hit no. And now let's pull up Pronterface. I am cabled USB to the board. The board should be on COM13, I believe, and the baud rate should be 250,000. We'll hit connect. Now if you do an M587, that's going to show you a list of remembered wireless networks. So wireless networks that I have connected to before. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove my wireless network. So I'm going to do M588 and then S and then in quotes the network name. M587 again, that network is gone. Now we'll reconfigure the network with an M587 command so that it has a static IP. So M587 S and then in quotes your network name and then P in quotes your password and then I. This is going to be the static IP address you want to use for your Duet board. Again, make sure it's not in the DHCP pool or not used by anything else on the network. We're going to use 192.168.1.187. Then J, that's going to be your gateway IP, minus 192.168.1.1. And then K, that's your net mask, 255.255.255.0. That's the most common net mask for almost all home networks. And hit enter. Now again, M587, your network is listed and it has a static IP. Now we'll do an M999 to restart the board. Now we can head back over to the web interface and make sure everything's all right. We'll just go ahead and refresh. And now the IP of your board should never change again. So we've got the main board set up and working well with the printer, and we've got the networking configured to use Wi-Fi and a static IP address. Now there is one other function that I wanted to test, but I was unable to, and that's the power off resume. Duet recommends that you use a 24-volt power supply so that you have enough power left over when the printer shuts off to move the Z out of the way and to retract some filament. This printer has a 12-volt supply, and no matter what I tried, I couldn't get the resume function to work. But I still do want to walk you through all the steps of getting that set up because it's not really as straightforward as it could be. So let's head into Settings, System Editor, we'll go into config.g. Scroll all the way to the bottom. This is the command that we set up when we did the configuration tool. It sets the voltage threshold that the main board needs to see to enact the power off resume. It's also going to back the extruder up 5 millimeters. So that configuration should be just fine. But we also need to create a new file. So we'll hit New File, and we need to create a file called resurrect-prolog.ue.g. And in this file, this is what it's going to read when the printer tries to resume. So the first thing we want to do is M116. This will wait for temps. A G28. This will home everything. An M83, that sets relative extrusion. And we want to undo the retraction that was done during the power off. So we'll do G1E4 at a feed rate of 3600. That will advance the extruder 4 millimeters to get the nozzle primed. And let's hit save. Now every time you pause the printer or the power goes off, it's going to create this resurrect.g file. It's going to dump all the information it needs to resume that print into this configuration file. So if the power goes off and you want to resume that print, you'll have to head over to the G-code console and run an M916 command. This will bring all your heaters back up to temp where the G-code left off and resume the print. So hopefully that's enough info to get you up and running with power off resume on your printer. Now there are just a couple other things I wanted to show you in the GUI about how the Duet works. Uploading G-code to the Duet's pretty straightforward. You just slice how you normally would, and then you export the file. And then from the web interface, you just head into G-code files, hit the upload button, find your G-code, and it will send it to the printer. And then to print something, you just click on that G-code file, and it'll start to print. If you need to send the printer any commands, you can just hop over to the G-code console, and you can enter whatever command you like. To pause or control the print while it's printing, you do that from the print status screen, and it automatically goes to that screen when the print starts. You can control baby stepping, fan speed, or extrusion factors. You can even upload macros or just sets of G-code commands. This is nice if you run the same G-codes over and over, maybe for bed leveling, so you don't have to enter them manually each time. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Hopefully that's enough information to get your board configured, or at least give you a head start. It was a little disappointing that I didn't get to test the LCD screen or the power off resume, but I'm sure we'll check those out on future projects. I do intend to release a review video after I've had a little more experience with the board, or maybe a comparison video of this board and a few others. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.